Another day, another development on the Hunter Biden, Joe Biden front as we continue to get new information in about what may not have gone down in Ukraine. It is good to see. I am again from the lodge way up in northern Maine, everyone. I can't ignore a good story, though. You know that. So I'm continuing to report for you for this podcast. Very good to see all of you here as always. I want to point out that this is the big thing that we were talking about yesterday. Remember, I introduced you to this article. This is something that came out in Newsweek, and the title was what really got me. I mean, it was a fantastic article. I'll add to that. Just really, really well thought out and well sourced. But what got me was the headline here: whether or not Ukraine might have any compromat on Joe Biden. I mean, that is something that you don't see every day, right? Like you just don't. So it definitely caught my attention. We are sponsored in part today by LegacyPMInvestments.com. If you're investing in gold or silver or interested in doing so, make sure you go check them out. LegacyPMInvestments.com today. All right. Again, this is the article that caught my attention, and I spoke to you about just yesterday because it's one thing for me to be saying it, and I've certainly been getting into a lot of this, and I have a background in financial reporting, and specifically actually some of the most successful reporting I've done in my career actually dealt with terrorist financing. And so I've spent time sort of looking at the web of financial activity that is of concern to places like, say, the U.S. Treasury Department. Well, it seems as though whatever Hunter and Joe and the Bidens were doing, it was certainly of decent concern to the government. I'm joined right now by Max Abrahms, who's a professor of political science at Northeastern University in my backyard there in Massachusetts, Northeastern University. It is wonderful to have you here, Professor Abrams, the author of the article I just mentioned. And I'll let you explain really from the beginning, sir. You said it's possible that there could be compromise. What is Kompromat?
Well, thanks for having me on your show. I use the word compromat almost tongue in cheek. I'm kind of making fun of legacy media. And the reason I only heard of it during the Trump administration. Throughout the Trump presidency, we were told just constantly, there was a daily deluge of stories about how the Russians had all this compromat on President Trump. What exactly the compromat was often switched, from day to day, but the main compromat story during the Trump years was the P tape, right? That came out in the Steele dossier. Trump allegedly had traveled to Moscow and had some prostitutes
Oh,
pee
wow,
on
you're
him.
really getting into it.
Right,
Like
right,
I don't even like to talk about it, but yeah,
right, yeah, right.
there were
So,
some
so
gory details
allegedly,
in there.
so
And I remember
allegedly,
BuzzFeed printing the whole
you
thing and me
remember,
looking at it. By the way, Professor Abrams, and saying, as a journalist, I'm looking at this going, this is like kind of strange. It feels like something I'd be reading in like Star Magazine or the National Enquirer, or maybe, I don't know, an opposition research report. It didn't really feel like, Professor, something that you would see in terms of actual real intelligence research. I mean, it
well,
read
well,
in such a way that was like the cliffhanger.
yeah. I mean, we know now that it was completely made up. That it was just like the journalists, like weird, like perversions and desire to hurt Donald Trump. But it was in the Steele dossier, which was part of Hillary Clinton's so-called opposition research. And the P-tape story and the compromise allegations might seem silly, and in a way, it really is quite silly, but it formed an important part of the Democrat narrative. And compromat has Russian origins, and it basically means compromising material, which you could use to embarrass a public figure, especially a politician, in order to exert influence. Just by the fact that you have the compromat, you can limit the range of choices, of behaviors of the politician because they don't want to be exposed, right? And so throughout the Trump presidency, we were told that this compromise is what made Trump a Russian agent, a Russian asset. He was constantly accused of being treasonous, of being pro-Putin, and it was of course totally baseless. So I asked the question in this Newsweek piece, well, is it possible that Ukrainian officials have real Kompromat, not made up Kompromat, not weird Kompromat, but
Weird,
actual
crazy,
Kompromat?
perverted compromise, uh-huh.
Yeah, on the
Which is
current
actual
president.
financial stuff.
Right. And so they're basic, it's very complicated, all of the allegations swirling around about Biden and Ukraine, but I like to think of it conceptually in terms of two main arguments. The first argument is that Joe Biden, as vice president, engaged in influence peddling. He was in cahoots with his son, Hunter Biden. The corrupt energy company Burisma was paying Hunter because of Joe's access as Obama's VP. So
Right.
that
And
that's
just to
one.
stop you there, because again, for everybody watching right now, we have a lot of people tuning into this live broadcast with the professor from Northeastern University who just authored a piece suggesting, hey, maybe we ought to look at perhaps the real stuff that could be going on. Again, just allegations at this point, but worthy of investigating. I just want to share with these viewers before you get to that, because he's talking about the $83,000 that was being paid to Devin Archer and to Hunter Biden, both so that they could consult for Burisma at a time when the vice president of the United States just happened to be the father of one of the guys that they brought on. So here's some video, everyone, of Devin Archer. This was the business partner of Hunter Biden, sitting down with Tucker Carlson just the other day at his cabin in Maine, apparently where all conservatives go. I'm just kidding. Anyway, here is Tucker Carlson and Devin Archer talking about that so-called access.
Did he have a sophisticated understanding of regulation, do you think?
I think that he led a team that had a sophisticated.
Okay, because I lived in Washington a long time around a lot of regulation. Also a very complex area.
Absolutely. I think you got to be an expert in knowing the guy, and he was the guy that was the expert in knowing the guy.
He was an expert in knowing the guy.
Right.
And who was the guy he knew?
Well, he knew a lot of people, but obviously there was some familiar, his brother, his father, some of his father's siblings. So he knew a lot of people. And obviously I know you're pointing to, the father being the key relationship.
Yeah, the father being the key relationship, Professor Abrams. So when you talk about the $83,000 a month that was getting paid to Hunter Biden, plus another 83 for his partner, plus, there's allegations of potentially a lot more. That's what you're saying is really possibly the compromising material, or just part of it.
That is a big part of it. So that's one sort of current, which is just the corruption, the fact that Burisma seems to have been paying the Bidens not just like tens of thousands of dollars, but millions of dollars. So it's reported that Burisma paid the Bidens $11 million. So that's
So that's
really.
what, if that's true. Now, we say that it's been reported. And by the way, I want to also just mention that there is, according to a Fox News digital article, a source that told someone at Fox News Digital that was related somehow to the FBI, that the FBI had learned from one of their sources. Now, by the way, you got to take all the sources at the FBI with a grain of salt, right? Because this is the same team that came up with that so-called dossier on Trump, but didn't bother to follow through and actually investigate it. Instead, they somehow thought it was worthwhile to, wiretap the Trump campaign's phones. Anyway, they somehow got information that $5 million was paid allegedly to Joe Biden. We don't know what's true effectively and not true, but I'm hearing these numbers. I'm looking, by the way, at the bank reports. I'm looking at 170, for goodness sake, SARS, suspicious activity reports. And Professor, I'm just like, I don't know, where there's smoke, there's fire, and somebody ought to be looking into this.
Yeah, they are. The problem for the Bidens is that it's not just allegations. Like if you were, following this story and then you stopped following it over the past few years and even few months and even few weeks, you wouldn't really know what was going on. I think that the Bidens are in trouble now for a reason, and that's because a lot of information is coming out, and it's not just allegations that could be easily dismissed. The Burisma partner who worked very closely alongside Hunter, who was apparently a good friend of Hunter's, and they traveled together and knew each other very well. Of course, he recently testified behind closed doors to a congressional investigation into this. And so what he said was under oath. So there's plenty of reason, I give that more credence when somebody actually is under oath. And what he said, right? Yes, what he said was that that the brand is, this is the word he used, the brand is the reason why Hunter was being paid so much by Burisma, and the brand was Joe Biden. And it wasn't, if you look at what he says, it wasn't just the illusion of access, which is the way Democrats are trying to spin this, but actual access that Joe Biden, who initially said he had absolutely no idea what his son did for a living and wasn't party at all to any of the conversations. We know that that's not true, that he was on speakerphone over 20 times, that he actually met with these shady foreign sources and executives in dinners, which initially Joe Biden said was just purely Russian disinformation and propaganda, but it has actually been substantiated. So we have moved out of the allegation stage for quite a number of the claims. But that's one set of allegations. But the other one, I think, in a way, is even more damning. And that is that the vice president at the time, Joe Biden, fired the prosecutor, essentially the attorney general of Ukraine, around like late February, March 2016, because this guy, Viktor Shokin, was investigating Burisma and was coming close to really laying down the hammer and exposing this corruption racket. So for a while now, it's been undisputed that Joe Biden did personally fire the prosecutor in Ukraine. And the reason why that's undisputed is because there's a big videotape of Joe Biden bragging about it while speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations.
Yeah, we've played it many times here, and there's an obscenity in there, and he's like, I fired his, you know what. Anyway, what I do want to point out, too, is what Viktor Shokin now himself, I don't know if you speak Russian, one of the viewers, I saw this yesterday, and I mistakenly said he was speaking Ukrainian, which I was corrected by one of our viewers saying, no, that's Russian. But anyway, here's Viktor Shokin. You'll see part of it, and we'll translate, of course. But Viktor Shokin saying that, he believes he was fired for a reason, and that reason was because he was looking into the payments being made to Hunter Biden by Burisma.
I just want to add one thing.
Yeah.
So what the Bidens were saying that they fired Shokin because he was corrupt and because he wasn't investigating Burisma. The Biden and the loyalists said that the investigation into Burisma at the time of the firing was quote unquote dormant. So if your viewers type into like Google dormant and Burisma, they will see that was stated all over mainstream media. And what the prosecutor is saying in this video is that all of those reports, all of that whole talking point spiel was complete nonsense.
So here it is in Russian.
В Украине, но я практически уверен, что Байден прекрасно понимал, что я намеков о прекращении дела Бурисмы не воспринял. Я шел дальше, я и мои коллеги. И мы дойдем до логического
I'm
завершения
just
этой
going to talk
ситуации.
over him a little bit here. He's saying basically that, Biden understood what he was doing. Biden used all the unofficial means at his disposal in order to, in particular, by using his men, he continues, including certain MPs, and then he names a few, as well as these so-called activists. He acted through them so as to not show his interest in this case. And Victor Shokin continues saying his personal interest. I mean, I always clearly distinguish Mr. Biden from the United States and the American people, he says. I clearly do, because in this specific case, Biden was acting on behalf of his own interests for his own family. That is the explanation, Victor Shokin says, in my opinion. He's actually very clear and quite nice about how he's just, nothing's been proven, but this is my opinion. And these allegations are there. And look, I mean, it's become a big scandal, as it rightly should, because I just look at it, Professor Abrams, and whether you're left or right on this one, I don't care. Like, you ought to want to know the truth. You ought to want to know what's going on. And you ought to be able to hope and expect that the vice president's kid and the vice president himself, we don't know if he's in cahoots on this, but aren't, basically trading off of policy for the United States.
And also directly interfering in the, domestic officials in Ukraine who, according to the prosecutor, were on the verge of divulging this Biden-Burisma racket. And Biden in the speech at the Council on Foreign Relations says that he was going to withhold U.S. aid to Ukraine, which desperately needed aid at the time, if the guy Shokin wasn't fired and replaced with someone, quote unquote, solid. Well, not only did Biden successfully fire Shokin, but the replacement put an end to the investigation into Burisma, which completely undercuts the Biden's rationale for the firing in the first place, because he said he was firing Shokin because he was corrupt and not investigating Burisma enough. The opposite is true. Burisma was being investigated, and the replacement put an end to the investigation. This isn't just allegations, though. We know that within 10 days of Shokin being fired, the founder of Burisma's assets were seized in Ukraine, and the founder fled the country. So that doesn't sound like a quote-unquote dormant investigation. They were really feeling the fire at the time, and this is why all evidence indicates he was fired precisely then, in February, March 2016.
But yet you're not allowed to say these things. I mean, I'm a journalist. I know this well, and there are certain things, right? Certain areas where, you dare not go. Of course, I don't really care. I'm happy to go there. I have a history of doing that. But anyway, here is Donald Trump back in 2020 in the campaign, bringing up this very issue. He gets it a little wrong. I think he says 183. He means 83,000, but he's talking about all the money that Hunter and Devin were getting. Watch this. I want your reaction.
It's an open discussion, please.
It's a fact.
Well, you have raised an issue. Let the vice president answer.
Discredited. Did Burisma pay him $183,000 a month with no experience in energy?
Mr. President,
my son did nothing wrong at Burisma.
I think he did. Mr. President, let him answer.
He doesn't want to let me answer because he knows I have the truth. His position has been totally, thoroughly discredited.
By who? The media?
By everybody. Well, by the media, by our allies, by the World Bank, by...
In other words, totally discredited, right? I mean, now it's not been so discredited. It's actually all come out. We saw, of course, his former business partner, Hunter Biden's former business partner, admit in that testimony that this is what they were getting. He admitted that, by the way, Dad would call in some 20 times to, say, hey, how you doing? And, it might be at a dinner. What's that about?
I mean, think about it. I mean, it's, obviously it's not just the dad. Like, this is the vice president. Like, presumably the vice presidents have something to do. The fact that, I mean, they should be, kind of maybe busy, but the fact that he's calling in 20 times, right? He's actually meeting with these shady executives in person at dinner, and we know that. The thing is, there's such a convergence of evidence now that it's harder and harder for them to hide from it. We have the Biden laptop, or the Hunter laptop, which was dismissed as Russian disinformation. Of course, it's now conclusive, by everyone that it was genuine. The materials in there, they capture emails from Burisma to Hunter, urging Hunter to alleviate pressure on them from Ukrainian officials and to make use of his influence, which is basically limited to the fact that he's the son of Joe Biden. We have the testimony of the Burisma partner under oath, as well as subsequent interviews where he could be at risk of, defamation or whatever. And Archer does choose his words rather carefully, it seems to me.
Yes,
You
yes.
also have a lot of sort of forensic financial investigations going on that are carefully tracking how the money was wired and distributed in very sort of shady ways using, various shell companies and things like that, right? So you have all of this evidence that paints the same picture, and that is strength for both areas of corruption. That there was an influence peddling scheme which enriched the Bidens, and that Joe fired the prosecutor in order to conceal that story.
It's wild. So we are live on YouTube right now. We are live on Facebook, and this is also on Apple Podcasts. Make sure, if you're watching, that you subscribe, and that you subscribe to all the platforms if you would. I'm getting a lot of viewer questions in or comments, and one of the viewers is saying, and perhaps that you could explain this, Professor. We're speaking with Professor Max Abrahms from Northeastern University, who's been looking into the money trail there with the Biden family. He said, one of the things I don't understand is that, the Biden family seem to be receiving millions of dollars from Burisma. Is that an allegation, or do we have any hard evidence of that? Now, I'm familiar with the allegation, right? The FBI apparently having some source reporting some $5 million, but you're talking about $11 million potentially. Is that sort of firmly out there, as opposed to Hunter just getting the $83,000 as part of his salary as a board member? Do you have any knowledge of that, sir?
That's a really good question. I might not be the best person to answer it, but it does seem, we do know for a fact that Burisma was paying Hunter Biden quite a lot of money. And I feel confident in saying that it's in the millions. And we also have every reason to believe, especially because of the Archer testimony, that the only reason why Hunter was being paid the money was because of his relationship with Joe Biden as the son. That was the only reason. There was no professional basis for being supplied all of this money by Burisma. In fact, the founder of Burisma said that Hunter Biden was stupider than his dog.
Yeah, that came out in the testimony as well. So clearly they weren't too impressed with the guy. There was a reason.
I'm not, yeah.
He was on
I
the
don't know
page.
what the exact figures are, but
see, that's what we got to know,
they're
right,
in the
Professor?
millions.
I mean, I think this is part of the point of your editorial. Everybody was so quick. I mean, my goodness, you tune into Rachel Maddow there on MSNBC, and they held her up like she was president of Harvard University or something. She was this like great academic scholar that was unraveling this whole mystery, and I'm like, the whole thing is a bunch of junk. I mean, you ought to be able to tell that just by frankly reading the darn report, because it reads like opposition research. And the fact that our FBI wasn't willing to actually follow that through and actually get real answers, but instead immediately went to wiretapping phones, That's bizarre to me. And then when they've got something that actually does kind of look real, and you got financial records, and you get somebody working for somebody, and then aid getting redirected, etc., why wouldn't you follow that trail through? That's a money trail worth investigating.
The other thing is it's particularly timely because the US is leading the largest, war in some ways since World War II in Ukraine against Russia. So, what I'm interested, especially, in whether there's any relationship between Biden's corruption in Ukraine and whether there could be any so-called Kompromat over him, and the
And
fact
does that
that
have
the
anything to do with why we're
president
spending
has
so much money?
led this NATO war against Russia in Ukraine. Now,
Okay, now you're saying the real unthinkable here. Like
no, no, no.
But it's a logical question, right? I mean, we're spending all this money, and I've been saying this, like, adjusted for inflation, you're looking at as much money, if not more by now, that we spent in Afghanistan. Now, fortunately, we don't have our own soldiers over there like we did in Afghanistan, but it's a lot of money. Well, simultaneously, we're well aware of the corruption that was going on over there. In fact, you had to have some of the people that were, running the army, etc. They wound up getting forced out by us because there was this alleged corruption, or I shouldn't even say alleged. In their case, they were like siphoning off money that we were sending. So you got to ask that, right? Like, I mean, how can you not?
I want to be a little bit clearer about what I'm actually saying. I'm not saying that, the likely existence of this compromise is why Biden has been such a, fierce ally for Ukraine. I think that even without any of this corruption, that he might have the exact same position towards Ukraine. However, I'm not sure that Joe Biden is in the position, if he wanted to really distance himself from Ukraine. I don't think Joe Biden could say, you know what, you guys are in a stalemate. The counteroffensive hasn't really been that successful. All this saber rattling, has led to more conflict with Russia than we expected. There are, nuclear threats. And the American public increasingly is turning against it. So now America, under my administration, wants to pull back from supporting you in Ukraine. I'm not sure Joe Biden is in the position to really discipline Ukraine and control Ukraine and to vastly change U.S. policy to Ukraine, because he does, I believe, need to worry about revelations that go all the way back to, his vice presidency.
So what is your theory then, that somebody in Ukraine actually does know that this is all there, that there are bank records? Yeah, I mean, we ought to have the bank records here, though.
Like, it's not speculative. I mean, the prosecutor who got fired remembers the conditions, the terms in which he was fired. I mean, Ukraine, they're not idiots. Like, when a vice president directly intervenes in the affairs of a foreign country that's at war and threatens them financially in terms of their support. I mean, the United States is a hegemonic superpower. Like, other countries listen very closely to what the president and what the vice president say and what they do. Ukrainian officials absolutely could provide additional color into the firing of this prosecutor, as well as the nature of the relationship between Burisma, the prosecutor, and the Biden family.
This is allegedly, right, what Trump was trying to get to. He kind of wanted that color, so to speak, during the campaign. He wound up getting impeached again because of it.
Remember all the brouhaha over Trump's conversation with Zelensky, where supposedly Trump, threatened U.S. assistance if the Ukrainian officials didn't look into the alleged Biden corruption. Well, Zelensky remembered it. Subsequent to that, Zelensky said, yes, of course I remember it. I'm not an idiot. And he was able to retell his recollection about what happened. In the same way, I think that Ukrainian officials could probably remember conversations with Joe Biden and his subordinates, for sure.
So, do you think if this happened, we're going to be cautious here because I don't like what MSNBC did with the dossier, et cetera, and CNN. I still want to say, look, you're innocent till proven guilty. But the set of facts, frankly, here, it doesn't look good. So if in fact this happened, I guess my other question would be, how unusual is this? I mean, we look at Clinton, for example. One of the complaints about Hillary Clinton was that, she was too in bed with all these foreign places all around the world. She'd been Secretary of State. Her husband starts, CGI. I'll at least give the Clintons this. At least, although, it's not good. It's not good that she was Secretary of State. But at least he was out of office, right? So he leaves office and then they're maxing it to the hilt. You do have to wonder, given that she was Secretary of State, how much that was all intertwined. I don't like the idea because it feels very seedy. And again, we don't want America to be for sale. How often do you think this kind of thing happens? I mean, do you think that it's potentially possible at all that Joe Biden's like looking at that going, hey, Bill's got it going on. I need somebody that can run my operation, and Hunter was the one to do it?
Well, I have a very cynical view of politicians. I think that if we're talking about corruption, if we're talking about politicians exploiting their positions in order to enrich themselves personally in an unfair way, because they have advantages over the rest of the American citizenry, I think that that's extraordinarily widespread.
Really?
When you look at, oh yeah, of course,
That's
when
how
you
they're
look at
making
the
their
net
money.
worth, yeah, you look at the net worths of people who go through Congress, all of their sort of insider dealings, the way that they absolutely, destroy the S&P and the Dow in terms of their returns year after year. So I think corruption in that sense is widespread. As a professor of international relations, what I think is particularly interesting is when there's a potential corruption connection to US foreign policy. And so for me, that's maybe one of the most interesting aspects of the corruption allegations in the Biden case, is because the corruption pertains to his relationship to Ukraine. And simultaneously, we're leading the largest war since World War II in Ukraine. And so I do think it's interesting and important to determine, to investigate, to consider what the relationship there might be. There were, the Clintons did some of that as well. For example, the country Qatar supplied the Clintons, I think Bill Clinton, like $1 million on his birthday through their foundation. And simultaneously, this was at the time when we were deeply worried about the conflict in Syria, and that there was Qatari-backed jihadists. And so at that time, Qatar was not, and has never been, a state supporter of terrorism. On the official list, Hillary Clinton was a big proponent of supporting the Al Qaeda-led rebels in Syria, many of whom were backed by that country. And so for me, that was interesting because what you had there again was corruption and a possible international relations angle. And so yeah, but corruption,
I mean, like, it's corruption, like, it's one thing, right? When you're looking at in the US and you see that, okay, maybe they're privy to a few too many hearings and they know a little too much policy that's going to affect various companies, and then they suddenly invest in them. By the way, that should be completely outlawed. I don't get that at all, at all, at all, at all. It's just pathetic. But yeah, I guess that's one way that they're making money. Another way might be when they leave office, right, to get fancy board seats, et cetera, because, again, they've got access to people that those people want to know to influence, again, policy. But then there's this international component, and it's tricky because, you know what? The U.S., we're the big kahuna. We are the hegemonic power of the world, and everybody wants to be our friend. So I guess if you really want to make money in this space, that might be the way to do it.
But I think that the other reason why these allegations are really bad for Biden is because, Joe liked to campaign, throughout his whole life on being like the everyday, American guy. What did they call him? Like Amtrak Joe, taking the train from Delaware. And now we know that he was being paid, he or his family both like being paid like millions of dollars from like foreign oligarchs. Like that's not a situation most Americans can relate to.
So,
Um,
so
yeah,
here's a question for you. And actually, it's coming up as I'm looking again. We are live, as I said, on YouTube and on Facebook. And I'm just watching some of the commentary come in. And some people, they keep getting back to this. And I hear this a lot. They're like, well, then who the heck is running the country? Like, who's really and truly in charge? I mean, in the case of Ukraine, back in at the time that this happened, it sounds like Joe Biden was definitely like in charge of what was going on in the U.S. vis-a-vis Ukraine. In fact, in that same clip that you've referenced there from his speech or his chat at International Relations, he actually says, they were like, wait, you can do that? And, he's like, well, call the president, just try me. Yes, I have that authority. I mean, I
yeah.
still think, and I think this was the frustration that a lot of the sort of so-called deep state felt with Donald Trump was calling all the shots and doing so in a way that often, ruffled a lot of feathers. It was not what people had anticipated or wanted, or maybe it was sort of out of left field for them and they didn't like that. But when people ask, and many are asking here, who is running the country? What's your reaction to that? As, by the way, I should say, as an expert in this field of political science and international security, and specifically in terrorism, counterterrorism, and U.S. foreign policy, I should point out, everyone, that Professor Abrams has held fellowships and other positions at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University. He's also been at Princeton, at Dartmouth, West Point Military Academy, Johns Hopkins. You're the guy. In other words, you are the guy, and you know a lot about this. So what is your response when viewers say, who's really running the show?
Well, I'll just provide a concrete example. And the example is the Hunter Biden laptop, right? And so what we know is that the Joe Biden campaign, the current Secretary of State in particular, asked I think it was like the interim director of the CIA to lead a public relations campaign saying that the laptop was Russian disinformation, and the interim director of the CIA obliged and got his friends across the intel agencies, the top people who you see on MSNBC and CNN every night, paragons of truth and intel
Brennan,
reliability.
Clapper, yeah.
Brennan, Clapper, all of them, and together they wrote a open letter, which initially they wanted to place in the Washington Post because Joe identified the Washington Post as being very sympathetic to his candidacy, but ultimately it ended up running in Politico. And then that was widely cited across all of the media. And then during the presidential debates, when Trump brought up the laptop, Joe Biden was able to cite the letter of the leading intel veterans in the country in order to say that the laptop wasn't real and that it was purely Russian disinformation. So I'm just gonna. Your viewers can reach that conclusion on their own. Who controls the country here?
I think we'll let them reach that conclusion on their own. I think you've kind of just said quite a bit. It sounds like, to me anyway, some of these agencies, along with the Democrat Party, along with the media, they're all in cahoots together, and they want to maintain this sense of power. And that's ultimately who is running things. And when someone else gets in there, they're not very happy about it. By the way, it's not just Trump. I mean, think about what they did to Bush. Think about Reagan. I mean, a lot of people that our conservatives are, Trump fought back rather spectacularly and not always in the ways that I would ever advise, but he really took them on, with two fists out there ready to fight. And again, not exactly the way it should always be done, but I would just say it's not like they haven't gone after conservatives before. And if anything, Trump coming in and all that happened, it probably made Bush look a whole lot better because they used to go after him. Listen, I'm going to get to some other stories. We got Disney earnings that just came out, and I know we're gonna tackle those right now. But I just want to thank you, Professor Abrams, Max Abrams from Northeastern University. I should say somebody else was wondering. They hope you're going to be okay because you're out on a limb here. You're going where you're not supposed to go. You've got tenure, right?
I do. I feel like I'm speaking with the evidence here. I mean, it's not popular, surely, certainly not in academia, but it is substantiated, I'm afraid.
Indeed. Indeed. All right. Well, listen, fascinating conversation. You can check out his column there in Newsweek. Thank you so much. It's great to have you here. I really appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you, Max. All the
My
best.
pleasure, anytime. Thank you so much.
All right. All right. So now you gotta get my shot back aligned. You can tell, guys, that I'm way up in the woods somewhere, right? On vacation. It
I
is
got to
wonderful.
take off, actually. I got to run.
Okay. Thank you so much, Max.
All
Anyway,
right.
it was wonderful to see him. I want to turn to Disney right now because Disney earnings have just come out, and that price hike apparently was kind of a problem for them. We're looking at their streaming video packages that didn't do so well. So for the second time this year, Disney just announcing a round of major price increases for its various streaming products. This is all tied to its ad-free versions of Disney Plus, Hulu, and they're going to raise these by 20% each. You mean to tell me there's no inflation? Anyway, the company's also raising prices on its Hulu Live television packages, and it announced the launch of a new bundle known as Duo Premium, which it's going to raise prices on as well. So this is news just crossing right now. Disney to raise prices on Disney Plus, Hulu streaming services. We had seen in the last earnings report how much they were suffering, so much so that in a recent interview with CNBC, Bob Iger, who stepped in to take over for the other Bob Chapek, who really drove the company down into the ground. Well, Bob Iger said they were going to get rid of the streaming, some of these businesses, including possibly ESPN, including some of its legacy TV businesses. I think there's a distinction I should make. They're probably more interested in the streaming side, less interested in the legacy television side, which would include, by the way, The View. So you know what? There's, for anybody who isn't such a fan of Whoopi Goldberg or Joy Behar or any of the rest of them, this is the good news. Bob Iger does not want to hang on to legacy TV that would include ABC, which runs and owns The View. So they're looking to sell those things off, possibly to some private equity entities who would just run them for whatever cash they could squeeze out of them, really try and reduce costs. The reality is streaming is the future. So all of us here right now, again, I hope that you've subscribed to the channel. It's really important. I hope that you've subscribed. Streaming, this is the future. In the old days, you would have had to get a live truck somewhere, and it would have been quite an ordeal, very, very expensive as well, in order to be communicating live, say, with an audience. And now all it takes, it's amazing, right, is a little computer setup. This is the future. And so people aren't going to have cable as much anymore. They're not going to have those network shows anymore. And so for those to continue to exist, they'll exist and they still will do fine, and that they still will be profitable enough, but you're not going to see them as real profit centers because the profitability will indeed be going to the streaming side of the business. Content creation is still incredibly, extremely important. Content's not going to go away, but it's just the mechanism by which it gets delivered. So Disney is struggling in this new environment, obviously under tremendous amounts of pressure. You've seen what's been going on with the theme parks. They're raising prices there too. Look, inflation hurts. And there's a lot of different places that people can go for the opportunity to watch all these various products. And so Disney has to stay competitive. Well, how do they stay competitive right now? Their idea is they're going to have these various services. Again, the price of Disney's ad-free Hulu service, it's going to go up from $14.99 to $17.99, making it more expensive than the most popular ad-free version of rival Netflix. So good luck with that. I mean, you're going to have some really, really good content if you're Disney in order to actually be streaming alongside something like Netflix, because subscriptions have gone down for Disney. It's actually been really fascinating to watch. They had been going down for everyone for kind of a while. And then in the most recent numbers that we've seen, Netflix surged. So they're really making this big comeback while Disney has continued to struggle. So earlier, they had reported losses that had narrowed a bit on the streaming business, $512 million in the third quarter. That would be from $1.6 billion in the year earlier period. So good news, they're reducing some expenses, and that improvement is certainly a sign that some of the cost controls that Bob Iger was putting in place are having a positive effect. In fact, Wall Street analysts polled by FactSet had expected a quarterly loss of $758 million, but what do you know? Disney's revenue rose 3.8% to $22.3 billion, and that was thanks partly to the parks business, which has seen a little bit of a resurgence, and operating income remaining flat at $3.6 billion. Look, I do think that this is a company that has been through a lot. It doesn't seem to know its way. It doesn't seem to know who it is. And that's in part because it's gotten caught in this cultural mess. When you look at companies like, say, Bud Light, Anheuser-Busch, they're another great example of companies not knowing how to navigate this space, this very highly politically charged space that's got a lot of cultural attachments associated with it. And so they think, okay, the answer is to go out and hire this influencer, Dylan Mulvaney, and they have no clue, no idea what that's actually going to mean to the actual customers. And in the case of something like Bud Light, it's just as easy. Frankly, it's better to switch to Miller Lite, right? Better beer. Sorry for all you Bud Light drinkers out there. I've never been a fan. But you can just easily switch beers. Now with Disney and its content, is there a rival that can really come on the scene? I mean, Netflix is certainly one on the streaming side, and I've got to believe that there will and can be others in terms of creating good family content. That's the problem right now, because they're getting away from those family values. And so you've seen other institutions try to come up with solutions. I mean, the guys over at Daily Wire are doing that. And we've seen Great American News, the Great American Family Network, that's the new rival to Hallmark. Someone is going to create a huge opportunity in this space, because Disney has made a series of errors. Anyway, let me see what else I can tell you. In the US and in Canada, Disney Plus had 46 million subs. This is down from 46.3 million in the previous quarter. And that, again, is the second time ever that the company saw Disney Plus lose North American subscribers. So that indeed is a problem. Television is a problem. The television business continued its decline. The company's linear TV segment that Iger wants to spin out of, well, that includes things like FX. It includes ABC, The View. Remember I told you about that. Also ESPN and the Disney Channel. Well, its operating income, it did fall 23% to $1.89 billion. That's about $100 million less than what analysts had anticipated. So, look, I do think that they've got to figure their way out of this hole, so to speak. They've got their challenges, and their challenges are in part self-induced. Yes, it's a tough political, cultural environment, but it's so important to know who you are and what you represent, and to really stick to that, and to remember the importance of your brand. One other thing I wanted to mention is that we saw today Moody's downgrade again, more downgrades for these banks. It just keeps on coming. And I'm warning you right now that this is going to be a problem going forward, because if you've got banks that have to mark to market, which they do, their treasury holdings, which are not worth as much, then guess what? We run the risk of seeing a lot more SVBs, Silicon Valley banks, down the road. And I think we're not out of the woods as far as that one goes yet. Not at all. It's one of the reasons why, if you're interested in diversifying your portfolio, you might look at something like gold or silver in that diversification process. And if you do, call my friends over at legacypminvestments.com, 1-866-589-0560. They will take good care of you. You're welcome to use my name, of course. They are my friends, and they'll be looking out for you. I'll tell you one thing. Their CEO, Charles Thorngren, who's going to be on the show next week, he predicted all of this. He actually predicted a banking problem that we saw SVB happen in March. He told me in November we're going to see this. And now, right now, he's been saying, look, the real challenge for the U.S. economy is going to be this regional banking disaster, which seems to be happening. Thank you so much for having. Great, Don. Good points on Disney. Very, very good stuff. I mean, keep watching this one because I think it's going to be. Look, I know nobody's really, really a fan of Bob Iger, but let me just tell you, I think he's a better alternative for shareholders than the other Bob, who was really, really swimming upstream. And the company is probably going to stay as liberal as it is, but as a shareholder, you got to look at this and say, how are they going to be able to figure it out? Can they figure it out? I think it's still up for debate, but they're in hopefully a better position than they were before. I think it would be smart to sell The View, very smart to sell ABC, and even ESPN, unless you can make it entirely just streamed online, because the legacy TV business is effectively over. Great to have you all here. Just a reminder, please subscribe to the show. Great to see you. We got more to talk about tomorrow. Of course, we're going to continue the conversation. Thank you, and I'll see you then.